The first light of dawn stretched across the rolling countryside, turning the fields of late summer wheat into waves of pale gold. A cool breeze carried the scent of fresh earth, wildflowers, and distant rain as birds sang from weathered fence posts. In a quiet farming valley where every family knew one another's hardships, appearances often determined how a stranger was treated. A man dressed in fine clothes could expect warm welcomes and hearty meals, while one in patched trousers and worn boots was often turned away before he spoke a single word. Nathaniel Ashford understood this better than anyone. At 29, Nathaniel was one of the wealthiest landowners in the region. His family owned thousands of acres of fertile land, prosperous ranches, and several successful businesses. His grand estate overlooked green hills, complete with elegant gardens, polished carriages, and servants who attended to every detail of daily life. Yet despite possessing everything money could buy, Nathaniel felt an emptiness that no fortune could fill. Over the years, countless women had smiled sweetly at him during social gatherings, church picnics, and town celebrations. Their compliments were plentiful, but their eyes often lingered more on his expensive watch, tailored suits, and family name than on the man himself. After several disappointing courtships, Nathaniel began to wonder if anyone would ever love him simply for his character. One evening, while speaking with his elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Ellsworth, he confessed his growing frustration. "I no longer know whether people see me," he admitted quietly. "Or if they only see everything I own." The wise woman smiled gently. "Then perhaps," she replied, "you should stop letting them see what you own." Her words stayed with him. Several weeks later, Nathaniel made a decision that surprised everyone on his estate. He packed away his fine clothing and dressed instead in faded work trousers, a rough cotton shirt, an old leather hat, and scuffed boots. He left behind his pocket watch, family crest, and expensive carriage. Carrying only a small bedroll and a worn canvas bag filled with basic tools, he set out alone under the name Nate. His goal was simple: to discover whether kindness still existed without wealth attached to it. For several days he traveled from one farming community to another, asking only for honest work in exchange for simple meals and a place to sleep. Some farmers barely looked at him before shaking their heads. Others assumed he was lazy simply because he arrived with little more than the clothes on his back. One man laughed openly. "We've got enough mouths to feed," he sneered. "Move along." Nathaniel thanked him politely and continued walking. Although rejection stung, it also confirmed what he already feared. Too often, people judged by appearances alone. Late one afternoon, after miles of dusty roads beneath the blazing sun, Nathaniel spotted a modest farmhouse sitting beside a weathered red barn. The white paint on the house had faded with time, and several fence rails leaned at awkward angles. Rows of vegetables struggled beneath the summer heat, while weeds crept between patches of corn. It was obvious the farm had seen difficult years. Near the garden, a young woman worked alone, lifting heavy buckets of water from an old well. Though exhausted, she continued without complaint, wiping sweat from her forehead before carrying another bucket toward the thirsty crops. Her name was Clara Whitmore. Since the death of her father 2 years earlier, Clara had worked every inch of the family farm herself. Each sunrise brought another list of chores: feeding chickens, repairing fences, tending crops, milking the family cow, and keeping creditors from taking the land her parents had spent their lives building. The work was relentless, but giving up had never crossed her mind. As Nathaniel approached the gate, he removed his hat respectfully. "Excuse me, miss," he called gently. "I'm looking for work. I can mend fences, care for livestock, or do whatever needs doing. I don't ask for much. Just honest wages and perhaps a place to sleep in the barn." Clara studied the stranger carefully. His clothes were threadbare, and dust covered nearly every inch of him. Yet his posture was straight, his voice calm, and his eyes carried a quiet sincerity she rarely encountered. She could have turned him away. After all, she could scarcely afford to hire anyone. Instead, she offered a small, tired smile. "I can't promise much," she admitted honestly. Money is scarce here. Nathaniel nodded. Whatever you can spare will be enough. Clara glanced toward the fields that still needed harvesting and the broken section of fence beyond the pasture. I could certainly use another pair of hands. She led him toward the barn. You may sleep here tonight, she said. And before we talk about work, come inside for supper. No one should begin a job on an empty stomach. Nathaniel looked at the humble farmhouse, then back at Clara. She had almost nothing to give. Yet she gave it anyway. As they walked toward the small kitchen, Nathaniel quietly realized that perhaps his search had finally brought him to someone whose heart was richer than any fortune he had ever inherited. The next morning, Clara awoke before the first rays of sunlight touched the fields. Like every day, there was work waiting. She expected to find her new farmhand still asleep after his long journey. Instead, she discovered Nathaniel already outside. He had filled 2 buckets with water from the well, chopped enough firewood for several days, and was quietly repairing the loose gate that had been hanging crooked for weeks. Clara stopped in surprise. You didn't have to start before breakfast, she said. Nathaniel smiled without looking up from his work. I've always believed the day rewards those who greet it early. She couldn't help but smile back. After a simple breakfast of fresh bread, eggs, and homemade blackberry jam, the two walked into the fields together. Clara showed Nathaniel the boundaries of the property, explaining how drought and poor harvests had nearly ruined the farm. My father always said this land could feed a family if you respected it, she said softly. I'm trying my best to prove he was right. Nathaniel listened carefully. He admired how she spoke of the farm, not as property, but as part of her family. Every fence post, every tree, every acre carried memories. Throughout the day, Nathaniel worked tirelessly. He repaired broken fences with remarkable skill, straightened sagging barn doors, sharpened worn farming tools, and gently calmed an anxious horse that no one else had been able to harness. His hands moved with the confidence of someone who understood farming far better than an ordinary laborer. Clara noticed. You've done this before, she remarked. Nathaniel shrugged. My father believed every man should know how to earn his supper. It wasn't a lie, though he left out the part that his father had owned one of the largest estates in the county. Within days, the farm began to look different. The leaking chicken coop no longer let in rain. The vegetable garden was reorganized into neat rows that made watering easier. A damaged irrigation ditch was cleared, allowing precious water to reach crops that had been drying under the summer sun. Yet Nathaniel never boasted about his work. Whenever Clara thanked him, he simply replied, "That's what neighbors should do." One afternoon, while they rested beneath the shade of an old oak tree, Clara handed him a cup of cool well water. "I wish I could pay you more," she admitted. "You've done enough work for 3 men." Nathaniel accepted the cup with a grateful nod. "You've already paid me." She looked confused. "How? You trusted a stranger." Clara lowered her eyes thoughtfully. "My mother taught me something when I was little," she said. "She used to say that kindness costs less than suspicion, and usually brings a better harvest." Nathaniel smiled. It was one of the wisest things he had ever heard. Not everyone in town shared Clara's generous heart. Each Saturday, farmers gathered at the general store to buy supplies and exchange news. Nathaniel accompanied Clara with a wagon full of eggs and vegetables. As they unloaded the produce, 2 local men glanced at Nathaniel's patched clothing and chuckled. "So you've hired yourself a drifter," one of them said loudly. "He probably works for supper alone," another laughed. Nathaniel remained silent. He had endured worse during his journey. But Clara stepped forward before he could respond. "He earns every meal he eats," she said firmly. "In fact, he's done more honest work this week than many men who've spent their time laughing." The men exchanged embarrassed glances before walking away without another word. Nathaniel was deeply moved. She had defended him without hesitation, expecting nothing in return. That evening, as they returned to the farm, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and crimson. "I hope I didn't embarrass you today," Clara said quietly. "You didn't," Nathaniel replied. "You reminded me that dignity isn't measured by a man's coat." Their eyes met for a brief moment before both looked away. Something had changed between them. It wasn't merely gratitude anymore. It was trust. For the first time in many years, Nathaniel forgot about his estate, his wealth, and the life waiting beyond the valley. Working beside Clara, sharing simple meals, and ending each day with honest labor brought him a peace he had never found in grand halls or expensive gatherings. Without realizing it, both of them had begun building something far more valuable than a successful harvest. They were building the quiet foundation of love, one act of kindness at a time. By early autumn, the Whitmore farm looked healthier than it had in years. The broken fences stood straight, the horses were well cared for, and the corn swayed gently in the cool morning breeze. Though there was still much work to do, hope had returned to the little farm. Nathaniel and Clara had settled into a comfortable routine. They worked side by side from sunrise until dusk, sharing quiet conversations between chores. Nathaniel admired Clara's determination, while Clara found herself looking forward to every new day they spent together. Yet Nathaniel's greatest question remained unanswered. Would Clara choose love over wealth if she were given the chance? The answer came sooner than he expected. One crisp Saturday afternoon, a polished black carriage rolled up the dusty lane leading to the Whitmore farm. Two elegant horses pulled it, and a well-dressed gentleman stepped down, brushing the dust from his fine coat. His name was Charles Beaumont, one of the wealthiest landowners in the county. Clara recognized him immediately. He owned hundreds of fertile acres neighboring several struggling farms and had a reputation for expanding his estate by purchasing land from families drowning in debt. Nathaniel watched quietly from the barn as Charles removed his hat and greeted Clara with a confident smile. "Miss Whitmore," Charles said warmly, "I hope I've not arrived at an inconvenient time." Clara wiped her hands on her apron. "What brings you here, Mr. Beaumont?" Charles glanced around the property. "I've heard you've managed to improve this place considerably. But I also know the bank expects payment before winter." Clara remained silent. She knew he was right. The farm's debt still hung over her like dark clouds. Charles continued. "I've come to offer you a solution." Nathaniel paused his work, listening from a distance. "If you'll agree to become my wife," Charles said smoothly, "I'll pay every debt on this farm. You'll never worry about another harvest, another bill, or another hungry season." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the fields. Then Charles noticed Nathaniel standing beside the barn. His smile faded. "And who might this fellow be?" "My farmhand," Clara answered. Charles looked Nathaniel up and down, barely hiding his amusement. "A drifter with patched clothes," he scoffed. "Surely you don't intend to waste your future keeping company with a man who owns nothing." Nathaniel lowered his eyes but said nothing. Every instinct urged him to reveal his true identity. One sentence could silence Charles forever. Instead, he remained exactly as he had promised himself he would, a poor farmhand with no fortune to defend him. Charles stepped closer to Clara. "You deserve far better than this life," he insisted. "Think carefully. I can give you comfort, security, and respect." Clara looked toward the farmhouse where her parents had raised her. She thought of the long days of labor, the nights spent worrying over unpaid debts, and the uncertainty that waited every season. Then she looked at Nathaniel. He had never promised riches. He had never made grand speeches. He had simply shown kindness every single day. Turning back to Charles, Clara spoke with quiet confidence. "I appreciate your offer." Charles smiled, believing he already knew her answer. "But I cannot marry someone I do not love." His smile disappeared. "My heart isn't something I can sell," Clara continued. "Not for land. Not for money. Not for comfort." Charles frowned. "You would choose poverty instead?" I would choose honesty, she replied. A life built on respect is worth more than a house filled with riches. For the first time, Charles had no reply. Without another word, he climbed back into his carriage and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust behind him. Silence settled over the farm. Nathaniel slowly walked toward Clara. You didn't have to refuse him because of me, he said softly. She smiled sadly. I didn't refuse him because of you. He looked puzzled. I refused because I couldn't spend the rest of my life pretending to love someone for what he owns. Nathaniel's heart pounded. Those words carried more meaning than Clara realized. That evening, after the chores were finished, Nathaniel stood alone beside the old oak tree overlooking the fields. His test was over. Clara had chosen integrity over wealth, love over comfort, and truth over convenience. Everything he had hoped to find in another person stood before him every day in the woman who had welcomed a dusty stranger with nothing more than a warm meal and a place to sleep. For the first time since beginning his journey, Nathaniel knew exactly what he had to do. Soon, Clara would learn that the poor farmhand she had defended so fiercely was not poor at all, but he prayed that when the truth came, she would still see the same man she had come to know beneath the worn clothes. The morning after Charles Beaumont's visit, the Whitmore farm was unusually quiet. Clara stepped onto the porch just before sunrise, expecting to see Nathaniel already at work in the fields, as he had been every morning since his arrival. Usually, smoke curled from the chimney of the barn where he slept, and the familiar sound of an axe splitting firewood echoed across the yard. This morning, there was only silence. A feeling of unease settled over her as she walked toward the barn. Nate, she called softly. No answer came. She pushed open the weathered barn door. The small corner where Nathaniel had slept was neat and empty. His blanket had been folded carefully, and the simple bedroll he had carried from town was gone. For a brief moment, Clara hoped he had risen early to tend the livestock. She searched the stable, the pasture, and the garden. There was no sign of him. Then she noticed something resting on an old wooden crate, a folded piece of paper with her name written neatly across the front. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, Nathaniel had written. Dear Clara. Thank you for giving a stranger more kindness than he deserved. You offered me honest work when others turned me away. You shared your table when you had little food to spare, and you treated me with dignity when others judged me by my appearance. Everything I have learned during my time here has reminded me that goodness still lives in this world. There is something I must do before I can ask anything more of life. Please do not think that I have left because of anything you said or failed to say. You have already given me more than you know. Until we meet again. Nate. Clara read the letter twice before lowering it slowly. She stared at the empty barn, struggling to understand why he had gone without saying goodbye. For the rest of the day, she worked in silence. Every corner of the farm reminded her of him. The repaired gate he had mended. The irrigation ditch he had cleared. The sturdy fence they had built together. Even the old oak tree where they often rested during the hottest part of the afternoon seemed strangely lonely. That evening, as she prepared supper, she instinctively reached for a second plate before realizing there was no one to serve. She quietly placed it back on the shelf. The days that followed were no easier. Neighbors noticed that Clara smiled less than before. Mrs. Harper, who lived on the neighboring farm, stopped by with a basket of fresh biscuits. Has your young helper moved on? She asked kindly. Clara forced a smile. I suppose he found better opportunities. But deep inside, she did not believe it. Nathaniel had never seemed like a man chasing easy fortunes. Still, she refused to let sorrow keep her from the responsibilities of the farm. Winter was approaching, and there were crops to gather, animals to feed, and debts that still demanded payment. Each sunrise, Clara threw herself into her work with renewed determination, though every evening ended with the same quiet ache. Meanwhile, many miles away, Nathaniel rode through the grand iron gates of Ashford Manor. Servants rushed outside, astonished to see their master dressed in faded work clothes. Mrs. Ellsworth greeted him at the front steps with a knowing smile. "You found what you were searching for," she said. Nathaniel nodded. "I found someone whose heart cannot be measured by wealth." Over the next several weeks, the manor became busier than it had been in years. Tailors arrived to prepare Nathaniel's formal attire. The finest horses in the stable were carefully groomed. A magnificent carriage was polished until it gleamed beneath the autumn sun. Nathaniel also instructed his steward to settle every outstanding debt attached to the Whitmore farm, but not to reveal who had paid them. "I want Clara to know she is free," he explained, "before she ever learns who I truly am." Mrs. Ellsworth smiled proudly. "You are no longer testing her heart," she observed. "No," Nathaniel replied quietly. "Now I must prove that mine is worthy of hers." On the evening before his planned return, Nathaniel stood alone on the balcony overlooking his estate. The stars shone brightly above the rolling hills. He thought of the little farmhouse, the scent of fresh bread in Clara's kitchen, the laughter they had shared during long days in the fields, and the courage she had shown when she refused to marry for money. Tomorrow, he would return, not as the penniless farmhand called Nate, but as Nathaniel Ashford. He knew the truth might shock Clara. She might feel hurt that he had hidden his identity. She might even refuse to see him. Yet he also knew that whatever happened next, their future would begin with honesty. As dawn drew closer, Nathaniel whispered a quiet prayer that the woman who had loved the humble farmhand would find it in her heart to forgive the wealthy man who had been hiding behind him all along. That harvest season was drawing to a close when an unfamiliar sound echoed across the quiet valley. Clara looked up from gathering baskets of apples as the rhythmic clatter of horses' hooves grew louder along the dusty road. Moments later, an elegant black carriage appeared over the hill, pulled by 4 magnificent white horses whose polished harnesses sparkled in the afternoon sun. She frowned. Visitors of such wealth never came to the Whitmore farm. The carriage rolled through the open gate and came to a graceful stop in front of the farmhouse. 2 uniformed footmen stepped down first, opening the carriage door with practiced precision. Curious neighbors began gathering along the roadside. Before long, several farmers and townspeople stood watching, whispering among themselves. Who could be visiting Clara? Has the bank finally come to take the farm? Perhaps some wealthy businessman wants to buy the land. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and slowly walked toward the carriage, her heart pounding. Then a polished leather boot appeared at the doorway. A tall gentleman stepped onto the ground, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark coat, crisp white shirt, and silver waistcoat. His hair was neatly combed, and a gold pocket watch rested against his vest. For a brief moment, Clara simply stared. The gentleman smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, Clara." Her eyes widened. Nate?" He nodded. "It is." She could hardly believe what she was seeing. The humble farmhand who had slept in her barn now stood before her looking every bit like a wealthy landowner. The crowd fell silent as Nathaniel removed his gloves and walked toward her. "I owe you an explanation," he said gently. Clara struggled to find her voice. You said you owned nothing." "I said very little about who I truly was," Nathaniel admitted. "And for that, I ask your forgiveness." He glanced briefly at the watching crowd before continuing. "My full name is Nathaniel Ashford." Gasps spread through the gathering neighbors. Everyone knew the Ashford family. They were among the richest and most respected landowners in the county. Old Mr. Jenkins removed his hat in disbelief. "The Ashfords," he whispered. "That can't be possible." Nathaniel looked back at Clara. "I disguised myself as a farmhand because I no longer trusted the smiles that wealth attracted. Too many people admired my fortune before they ever knew my heart." Clara listened without interrupting. "I wanted to know whether someone could value a man with empty pockets but willing hands." He smiled softly. "You did more than that. You welcomed a stranger when you barely had enough food for yourself. You trusted me." You defended me when others laughed. And when a wealthy man offered you comfort in exchange for marriage, you chose honesty instead. Tears slowly filled Clara's eyes. You were testing me. Nathaniel lowered his head. At first, yes. I never intended to hurt you. But somewhere between repairing fences, sharing meals, and watching the sunrise over your fields, the test ended. I stopped pretending. I simply fell in love. The valley became perfectly quiet. Even the whispering neighbors seemed to disappear as Clara searched his face. She saw no pride. No arrogance. Only the same gentle eyes that had looked at her across countless evenings beneath the old oak tree. Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket and removed a small velvet box. He opened it slowly, revealing a simple but beautiful diamond ring. Then, without hesitation, he knelt on one knee before her. Clara Whitmore, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, you taught me that kindness is worth more than gold and that honesty can grow in the poorest soil. You loved a man you believed had nothing. I stand before you today with every blessing life has given me. But I would gladly leave every acre, every carriage, and every coin behind if it meant spending my life beside you. He looked up into her tear-filled eyes. Will you do me the greatest honor of becoming my wife? The gathered crowd held its breath. Clara covered her mouth with trembling hands. For several long moments, she could not speak. Finally, tears slipped gently down her cheeks as she whispered the words Nathaniel had prayed to hear. Yes. A joyful cheer erupted from the neighbors. Mrs. Harper wiped away tears with her handkerchief. Old Mr. Jenkins laughed so loudly that even the horses lifted their heads. Nathaniel rose to his feet, carefully slipped the ring onto Clara's finger, and took both of her hands in his. The afternoon sun bathed the farm in golden light as the humble farmhouse, once a symbol of struggle, became the place where two hearts, tested by hardship, strengthened by kindness, and united by truth, began the next chapter of their lives together. News of Nathaniel Ashford's unexpected proposal spread across the county before the sun had fully set. By the next morning, every general store, church porch, and blacksmith's shop buzzed with the same remarkable story. The wealthy Ashford heir had lived as a poor farmhand. He worked beside Clara Whitmore for weeks. And she loved him before she knew he owned a single acre. Some people admired the story. Others questioned Nathaniel's unusual test. But those who truly knew Clara understood that her answer would have been the same whether Nate had arrived on foot or in the finest carriage in the county. A few days after the proposal, Nathaniel returned to the Whitmore farm, this time without servants or formal clothing. He wore a simple work shirt and sturdy boots, the same kind he had worn while laboring beside Clara in the fields. As soon as she saw him, Clara smiled. I was beginning to wonder if the gentleman in the fine carriage had forgotten how to mend fences, she teased. Nathaniel laughed. I believe the farmhand still remembers. Together they spent the afternoon repairing a section of pasture fence damaged by a recent storm. Passing neighbors smiled as they watched one of the wealthiest men in the county swinging a hammer beside the woman he loved. Nothing about Nathaniel's fortune had changed his heart. One evening, while they sat beneath the old oak tree where their friendship had first begun to blossom, Clara turned to him. There is something I must ask. You may ask me anything. Why did you pay my debts before telling me who you were? Nathaniel looked across the fields, where the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and crimson. Because I never wanted you to feel that accepting my proposal was the only way to save your farm. He gently took her hand. I wanted you to be completely free. If you had refused me, the land would still have belonged to you. Clara's eyes filled with tears once again. You gave me freedom before asking for my future. Nathaniel smiled softly. Love should never feel like a bargain. Preparations for their wedding filled the following weeks with excitement. Neighbors who had once pitied Clara now volunteered to decorate the little white church with wildflowers gathered from the surrounding hills. Women baked pies and fresh bread, while the men repaired roads leading to the church so elderly guests could travel comfortably. Mrs. Ellsworth embraced Clara as though she had gained the daughter she had never had. "My boy has waited many years for someone like you," she whispered. "And I have waited many years to meet him," Clara replied. On the crisp autumn morning of their wedding, sunlight streamed through the stained-glass windows of the country church. Nathaniel stood at the front, his expression calm but filled with emotion as Clara walked down the aisle in a graceful ivory gown. She carried a simple bouquet of white daisies and wild roses gathered from the fields surrounding the farm where their story had begun. When the minister asked if Nathaniel would love and honor Clara through every season of life, he answered without hesitation. "With all my heart." When Clara was asked the same question, she smiled through happy tears. "I already have." The church filled with joyful applause as they exchanged rings and were declared husband and wife. After the wedding, Nathaniel kept every promise he had made. He never asked Clara to abandon the farm she loved. Instead, they restored it together, adding new barns, healthy orchards, and improved irrigation while preserving the little farmhouse that had first welcomed a weary traveler with patched clothes and hopeful eyes. The Ashford estate also became known for its generosity. Nathaniel established fair wages for every worker, offered interest-free loans to struggling farmers during difficult harvests, and created a community grain reserve so that no family in the valley would go hungry during harsh winters. Clara organized sewing circles, reading classes for children, and weekly meals for widows and elderly neighbors who lived alone. She reminded everyone that kindness, not wealth, was the true measure of a person's character. Years later, visitors often asked how such a happy marriage had begun. Nathaniel would smile and answer, "It started with a bowl of warm soup, a place to sleep in a barn, and a woman who saw worth where others saw only worn-out clothes." Clara would squeeze his hand and add, "And it lasted because the richest thing either of us ever possessed was never money, it was trust." Together they proved that fortunes may build grand houses, but only humility, compassion, and unwavering love can build a home. Their story was told for generations throughout the valley, reminding every young heart that true love is never measured by the weight of a purse, but by the generosity of the soul.